All right. Well, why don't we get started? Good morning. My name is Jeanne Kaliszewski. I am a Curate, Episcopal priest. Title is Curate at Grace Memorial Episcopal Church in the Lloyd Center district of Portland. Delighted to be with you all this morning. There's some folks from Grace who are joining us as well, which is great. I love this format in that, you know, why weren't we always doing this? Getting two churches together, clergy, congregants together to have conversations. So again, this is, I think, one of the many learnings and opportunities that we have been offered in this time of pandemic and social distancing. And I hope we figure out a way to continue to at least, lean into what we've learned in some ways around things like this. So I am grateful for Matthew and Nathan for inviting me into this space, for the folks of Grace who were able to join us as well, and for you at Trinity for welcoming me here on what is a lightning fast encounter with a really complicated movement in the United States. So, and also globally, the book goes on to tell us. So I'm going to open us in prayer, and then I will spend a few minutes just kind of going through briefly through the last part of the book. So I will start us in prayer, and then we're going to have some discussion. Keith Walters from Trinity has offered to help us manage the conversation a little bit. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity to come together through time and space to gather and wrestle with the ways you are calling us to be church in this time, in this place. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together people who have not met in real life often, but can gather here to discuss things that are hard, that are challenging, and also to look for the ways in which you are calling us to reimagine and re-engage with the way this country and the way the church might be. Be with us this morning as we discuss this book, discuss the ways that we are hearing your word in our lives. We ask all this in the name of the one you sent to walk this journey along the way with us, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, great. So as I said, I'm going to just spend a couple minutes talking about the last portion of the book, and then we're going to have a couple sort of open-ended discussion questions. Keith Walters from Trinity is going to help manage that discussion part. So the last part of this book I thought was really interesting. And in fact, maybe because some of it I think I was a little more familiar with than I was with previous portions of the book. So maybe it sort of resonated a little bit more with kind of what my sense of how Christian nationalism had been sort of showing up in the public realm for these past few years. There's a interesting chapter on data analysis. And I won't go too much into that. I mean, I think it just was a good reminder of the ways in which technology has made a lot of what we see possible. I don't think that's a surprise to many of us. I mean, I think that we could have a whole other forum on the way that technology, social media has sort of impacted all our lives in a lot of ways and sort of contributed to a lot of the polarization that we've seen, I think, in recent years. And I read an interesting piece that I will share in the chat in a little bit, written by a woman who works for the United States government. It escapes me who she works for, who's also a former Christian evangelical, or actually is an evangelical Christian, who was addressing the rise of QAnon specifically in the past year or so. And she talked about not only technology, but the pandemic and the ways that the pandemic has isolated us from one another. And that extreme social isolation actually has, in her mind, and this made some sense to me, contributed to the vulnerability that a lot of people have to diving deep into some of this conspiracy theory, diving deep into some of these kind of more shady, radical corners of the web, because in some ways there's community there, right? And so it just got me thinking again about this community and the ways in which the role that community can play in not only this time in us gathering and wrestling with these questions, but as we begin to emerge into something new, once we are back in physical location with one another, the importance of community in sort of working against some of the what we've seen in this book and some of what we've seen in what we saw on January 6th, and kind of offering a different vision of what community might be. So then we go into chapter 9, a really good and interesting conversation about public schools, right? And the sort of public school, anti-public school movement, which again, I think I was a little more aware of. Certainly all of us are familiar with Betsy DeVos. It was interesting to sort of understand the sort of way in which that that family and in that specific part of Michigan. I have a friend that lives in Michigan. I was like, what's going on in Michigan? He goes, oh, don't get me started. So, the ways in which a lot of wealth that was developed in a really kind of small pocket in Michigan had an outsized impact in a specific area, which was vouchers and charter schools, and as a way to undermine public schools as a full-on institution, right? As a part of the way we are as a country, a way to kind of infiltrate and undermine the public schools institutionally. So super interesting, super upsetting, honestly, discussion of the ways in which this sort of Christian nationalist movement leveraged money, power, and a kind of long game on the area of public schools, starting with vouchers in certain areas, finding that vouchers really didn't sort of work publicly and as a public policy sort of initiative, and then moving into this notion of charter schools. And also the ways, and this is something I have continually been fascinated by, is that the ways in which sort of extremes on one side or the other can kind of overlap, right? So you have this sort of extreme libertarianism around charter schools and vouchers, which you kind of consider maybe kind of a far left way of looking at things, and then this extreme right, and the way they can kind of come together. The extremes can kind of merge in similar goals with completely different ideologies that back them up. Super interesting. I think there's a comment. Right, Betsy DeVos, we expect to return our investment. Exactly, and the role in which money just plays in politics. I don't think any of us are surprised by that, but it was a really stark comment on the ways that really was. And again, a sort of truly capitalist mindset, right? The way that capitalism has become a fundamental, integral part of this, honestly, of the theology of this Christian nationalist movement, right? It's that point was made again and again, that capitalism is sort of the best example of God's hope for this world, which we could spend a whole other forum talking about that. The next chapter was on theocracy from the bench. Again, this is something I would think I was a little more familiar with, the kind of push around the courts, but I had focused primarily on getting judges appointed, right? That was a big reason a lot of folks voted for the last administration. That was a big call in that sort of political movement. But I was really interested in the ways in which, and I know we have, well, at least I know personally a couple lawyers on this call, really interesting sort of different explanation of a number of different decisions that have contributed to this sort of, again, breaking down between church and state, right? So FEMA funds being able to go towards churches, the tax exemption that pastors and clergy are allowed to take for their housing, the ways in which there are carve-outs in the sort of legal status of churches and clergy people that make the lines between the church and the state a lot fuzzier. Even something as simple as, allowing state funds to go towards, what was that? I don't remember the name of the case, but allowing state funds to go towards improving a playground on the church grounds, right? But that was a huge win for this movement, because again, we have the commingling of money from the state with the church enterprise. So super, super interesting, chapter on that part of the movement. And then the author in the next section talks about controlling bodies, what religious liberty looks like from the stretcher. This is obviously the most personal chapter for the author. She ends the chapter with her own experience of going to a Catholic hospital, being in the middle of a miscarriage and having to sort of navigate what the ethical and religious exemptions for Catholic hospitals would or would not allow them to do in terms of intervening with what they thought was might be considered an abortion. Again, I think the ways in which, I think this is a really interesting chapter for a number of reasons. I think the first is it reminds us to look beyond simply, oh, it's evangelical Christianity, right? There are conservative religious folks in every flavor of religion that has ever been, right? And so it is not simply an evangelical Christian thing. And there are evangelical Christians, I want to remind all of us here, who have wonderful theology that is really not, we can't lump all evangelicals into this group. And so I do think we need to be careful in bringing a little more nuance to the discussion. I'm thinking about people like, I think I mentioned last time, Rob Bell and Brian McLaren are two evangelical pastors that I love their work. I have been in evangelical churches, and I am stunned and moved by the way the Spirit is present in worship in a lot of evangelical circles in a way that is different than how we experience it in our more liturgical setting. And so it's just a good reminder that we need to sort of bring a little more nuance to how we think about this movement and who's participating in it. Conservative, Catholic, Catholicism is actually a pretty big part of what's happening in the United States, and mostly among younger clergy is my understanding. And so that is like a whole other thing happening. But I think, again, the ways in which women's bodies, the role of women within the marriage, within power structures, that sort of thing is something that's an essential part of any time we're talking about a movement such as this. So I found this chapter hard to read for many reasons, but it was a really helpful thing to pay attention to. And also I'd just like to name that I think that, we always have to remember the ways in which race and class play into these issues as well. I remember my daughter at the last election, who's a teenager, feeling really anxious about the ways in which the new administration might affect her reproductive choice and health. And me sort of appeasing, comforting her by saying, well, we could take care of what we needed to take care of. Like we have the means, the class and the wealth in which that we could navigate a complicated and hard system. And a lot of folks are not in that position. And so a lot of things like what was discussed in this chapter, I think are disproportionately affecting communities of color, poorer communities. If you live in a community where there's only one hospital and they don't provide any reproductive care or abortion, and you have to take 3 days off work to travel somewhere else, that is a burden that a lot of folks cannot take on. Finally, there's a good discussion about the sort of global aspects of this movement, talking about Russia and the ways in which there's resonance with what's going on in a lot of other countries as well. And then the author has a nice epilogue which says, oh, but don't worry, everything will be okay, which I thought was nice, but also that's part of what I would like to wrestle with you all this morning. So I guess I would like to open it up to some thoughts and feedback. The first question I'd love to ask of this group, and again, feel free to put answers in the comments or raise your hand, is what, I was describing this movement to someone at Grace. It feels like it's a hydra, right? Like there are so many heads, so many ways that this is sort of showing up in this country and in this time. I'm just wondering, what surprised you the most? What did you learn in this book or in this sort of discussion that we've seen in recent years that really kind of took you by surprise, in a good way, in a bad way, that sort of thing? So I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak to that.
Okay, in terms of what people are posting, we've got vast power of money in diverse areas of impact: health, education, and law.
Absolutely.
How deliberately Christian nationalists have co-opted politics into their theology. How scary and well-planned it all is.
What's interesting to me about that comment about how scary and well-planned it is it also seems like completely decentralized in a way, right? Like it's really well-planned, but it's not like there's Q at the center, right? And so that's a really interesting comment. I've been really wrestling with it. That's one of the paradoxes I've seen in this book.
Long-term efforts of the Christian right to influence or impact many areas of American life. They've been planning this for decades. And I don't think we're aware of how very frightening and offensive the woke culture of the left is, like the threat of mind control, daring A, and something got cut off there.
Can I pipe in? I hit the wrong button, and I was meaning to say during a Red Scare. I mean, people are really terrified of this kind of control, and they see that. And I think we're not maybe sensitive enough to how really frightening that is for people.
Right. And as I'll just add, as I noted last week, one thing I struggle with is how to not see all this as a terrible conspiracy that becomes my version of QAnon, and then I end up responding to it just the way that many very conservative people get trapped in that. And so that I think is a challenge for those of us on this side. Woke culture is basically, it used to be a compliment, but now it's often used derisively. This is a question: what is woke culture? To refer to people who are paying attention to social justice type issues all the time. Someone's commented on how easily the court succumbed to resistance to separation of church and state. And one of the things talked about in some of the resources I list is the way that whole notion has been reframed by the Christian nationalist. Someone has said that they think that evangelicalism is a response to the fear in our country and probably the world these days. People are afraid. This is picking up, I think, on what Karen was just saying. And so that they've been failed by institutions that they had come to believe in for certainty. But because of lots of things going on, they start now clinging to this. Other observations shared? Sure, yes, Karen.
Well, I just want to add something to the definition of woke culture.
Please.
I mean, I agree with you, but I think that how people are seeing it is that it's completely not nuanced, totally judgmental,
right.
Associated with also so-called cancel culture. There is no room for listening to everyone. And I think that that's why it's become something that is derisively used. So I think that's something that I'm trying to be aware of.
Right.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think I'll see if I can find it, but there was someone who, there's a teacher, I think, who's at Smith College right now, who talks about calling in folks instead of calling out folks, and sort of what how the nuance might work on that. I see Kimberly has her hand raised.
Yeah, in terms of the cancel culture versus woke, or not necessarily more the cancel culture notion, I do think institutions of higher education and other institutions need to respect the idea of free speech. But on the other hand, I think in some ways they've been too careless to actually invite the really crazy people to speak to their students. And I don't know if that's happening as much, but I think I don't, at some level, I don't blame students for actually rioting or, you know, trying to shun those speakers, but they too have gone too far without being open to some of the fact that some of these people actually have legitimate and thoughtful arguments, but they're not actually crazy in the way that we would perceive them to be. I don't know if other people have followed that trajectory or noticed, or am I also against free speech if that's the way that I think?
I do not have my raise hand button off, but I am tired of being patient and listening to the one side and on the other side. I'm really tired of us being patient and just trying to understand what everybody is saying. I'm really sick and tired of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't cancel people. Maybe this woke culture is bad. I am sitting on the other side where white privilege is expressed in every single aspect of my life. And sometimes I wonder, what exactly are we doing? We are always waiting for the other side to come to us.
Yeah, thank you, Yetunde. And that actually is a perfect segue to the next question. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think the next question is how might we respond as Christians to this movement? And part of what I've been reflecting on, I'll just start with my own thought about this, and then I'd love to hear people's thoughts, is really settling into our own tradition, to speak out of our own tradition rooted in the life of Jesus Christ, in speaking out of it affirmatively and loudly, rather than like, well, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, which absolutely is true. And I totally hear what you're saying, but instead of focusing on how can we combat this, actually speaking affirmatively and positively into the public square and offering another vision of what it means to be a Christian, engaging in the public square, a Christian rooted in the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. I think I noted earlier in the discussion, the presiding bishop made the comment that it's remarkable how rarely Jesus gets quoted in this kind of rhetoric, right? We get a lot of the epistles, we get a lot from Paul, we might get 1 Timothy or Leviticus thrown in, some of the sort of cherry picking from the Old Testament. But really, if you ask, where's Jesus in this? Jesus is not in that, in the theology and the rhetoric of that movement. And again, that's one of the paradoxes I saw in this book, is a movement that's focused on a biblical worldview that is very rarely using the Bible and engaging the Bible in a deep way. And so how as Christians are we called to respond? How are we called to respond? Speak like Bishop Curry. I will say, thank you, Anne, when Bishop Curry came to our clergy group right before the ordination and consecration of Bishop Akiyama, there was a comment made, and I've been reflecting on it, that how important it is that the leadership, that Bishop Curry speaking out on these issues really is such a powerful model for all of us to continue to speak out and to name the evil that we see. To Yetunde's point, this is not about like, oh, come on in, we'll forget. We name the evil. And I think also say that there are a few things that are non-negotiable. It is non-negotiable to say that anyone is not made in the image of God. That is a non-negotiable. And then we kind of continue to navigate this way, delving into our own personal and systemic racism, absolutely. And then that is incumbent on all of us who are white to continue to I was on a call with Austin Channing Brown. I don't know if y'all are familiar with her work, but someone asked, what are the pitfalls that the sort of progressive woke side of the conversation around race and racism falls into? And a couple of the pitfalls she named were, well, reading 3 books and deciding that you're an expert, and not continuing to read and continuing to wrestle with these issues. And also that we are called to follow people of color and leaders of color. You know, she said, white people love to lead, and it's time to stop. it's time to stop. That's not our role in this time. Kimberly, did you want to say something?
I find myself, having read 3 books and counting myself an expert, but I think I did read something that I thought was pretty powerful. And that was, as you read, you know, things that you think are enlightening, it's like if you're reading, you know, Michael Eric Dyson, or you're reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, or you're reading this book, and I'm sorry, I can't remember which of these people said this, or which of the authors said this, but how very important it is to do something like journaling every day so that you're actually processing that information more deeply. Otherwise, it just kind of stays in your frontal cortex where you pretend to be an expert rather than reflecting on your own actions in light of what you have learned. And I practically started crying when I heard that, because I recognized myself in the like, oh, well, you know, blah, 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 blah. Aren't I clever? Rather than really looking more internally into how I deliberately change my actions.
Yeah, that's repentance, right? We have to really, really dig into that deeply. Yeah.
Pam wanted to say something.
I have a question. The way we're all responding is, what can we do on an individual level, an individual response to try to communicate, deal with people on the other side or people of different beliefs. One of the things that I took from this book is that unless we as Christians and people who are our supporters start to organize politically, I mean, we're up against a juggernaut of right-wing, you know, very strong-minded, wealthy plutocrats who have tried for decades to change the narrative, to change the institutions, to change the structures in our country. And unless we start to organize politically, I mean, it's all well and good to talk about, you know, individual conversations with people and so forth. But there is the issue of political power. And we are at risk in this country of losing some of our beliefs because we don't have the political power to make any changes. Am I wrong about that?
I think it's like anything, right? You're absolutely right to name the sort of systemic piece, right? And then the individual piece. I think both those parts are important, but I think you're right. It's easier in some ways to focus on the sort of individual piece, or I don't know, not easier, but it's like, oh, I can read this book and I can journal and I can do those things, which are super important. And I think you're right. I've struggled with this book because it's, right. Like, at what point are we ceding so much to the other side who seems less constrained by the rules?
Exactly. They don't care about the rules
that we've been sort of so careful to be mindful of. And, for me, it's less about, well, let's create a political action committee of, Portland Episcopalians, but it is about, and again, I don't want to overstate this as an individual level, but maybe trying to think about the ways in which we integrate our faith into every aspect of our lives and the world, right? And the ways in which maybe, part of what this book provides are a number of areas in which we might be called as a group to engage publicly around an issue, right? So I'm thinking about all the Black Lives Matter protests that happened, were really in full swing over the summer. How do we show up as a church? How do we show up as denomination around some of these issues? I definitely hear what you're saying. I don't have an answer for it, but I think you're absolutely right. That is part of what has been sticking with me in this is, are we being too careful? So yeah. Todd, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think, over the years, there was a real thing called the Protestant Establishment 100 years ago. And it seems to me that the wall of separation that has been built by the Supreme Court has been a recognition that we become more and more a diverse country, and that the wall of separation is there to let everybody play. And as our country has become more plural in its character. And I think there are ways of building a very robust theology around that recognition, and a recognition of the utility of some form of secularity, but also the giving ourselves a voice that we can participate, like you're saying, in this civic conversation also, and not ceding it all to the conservative evangelical movement. And so far, so much of it has been ceded simply because of their organization. It might be a little decentralized and ad hoc, but certainly very powerful. But I think there's a part of secularity that intimidates us all, even as thoughtful, progressive Christians, that we think that there's part of our speech that we have to hold back in that civic engagement. And no one wants their speech held back in such a, when it comes to matters so profound as faith and a faith community. So we have to learn how to participate on an equal footing, but we can't cede the entire religious conversation, establishment conversation over to the conservative evangelicals. That's for sure.
Right. And I also think, part of that is reclaiming, we had a conversation the other day, reclaiming the word evangelism, right? And what it means to be an evangelical church, right? I think that, as Todd knows, because his wife, Nikki, is Greek, and we had this conversation on a call last Friday, the Greek word evangelio, it means to sort of share the good news, right? To speak the good news. And what does it look like for us to show up in the public sphere, in civic life, speaking the good news, being present in a way that is part of the conversation from a specifically Christian perspective, from a perspective of that is rooted in the life of Jesus, right? And I think that is super important. And I think, there is some examples of how that has played out here. I mean, Nathan, your own dean and a few clergy were arrested, I don't know, when was that, a couple of years ago, at a demonstration over the immigration policies of the previous administration. It means, I think, showing up with our bodies to kind of tie in to some of the conversation earlier. I think, I know I like nothing but to listen to another podcast or read a good book about something that's going on, but how are we as an incarnational people, an incarnational faith, called to show up, and again, recognizing all the constraints we're under right now because of the pandemic, so I don't want to overstate, I understand what this means at this time, and we are certainly constrained. But as we look forward to being able to sort of be more in the world with our bodies, where do we want to show up with our bodies to kind of be a witness to the faith and the theology that we want to represent in the world? How would the conversation about folks who are experiencing homelessness in the city change if we continue to sort of show up and say, we need to do something about this, not because it's messy on the streets, but because everyone is made in the image of God and everyone deserves to be treated as such? And how does that sort of change the conversation around some of these questions that have become, such flashpoints right now? Keith pointed out that the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website will have some resources. I do, yeah. I shared that link last week. I again would encourage y'all to check out that organization, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I think it's a super helpful resource. And I think that also recognizing that there are so many, I mean, I guess the good news of this book, which showed the sort of hydra of all the ways Christian nationalism is showing up in this country at this time, also provides a number of spaces in which we might feel called to show up, combating, showing up against racism, white supremacy. And to me, that is really, I think we do have to come back to that being the very root of so much of what is happening in this country, the sort of original sin of this country, which is slavery, and really reckoning with that, and really looking for ways to not just, to talk about it, but show up and do the kind of real change that needs to happen. And I think that, having these conversations about the ways in which Christianity has been, in my mind, kind of hijacked in a lot of ways into kind of an American exceptionalism, and calling out the ways in which that we will not stand for that rhetoric, and we will not stand for the ways that this has been sort of played out in the public sphere. Sally said, scattered groups of faith attempting to mobilize a network to impact legislation. Legislators say hearing moral voice is important. Yeah, Interfaith Alliance on Poverty is one such organization, absolutely. I would also commend to you Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, which is another really wonderful organization in our space that does have a sort of legislative lobbying day where people of faith are called. I think they just had it recently, it was online, but people of faith are called to go down and meet with their legislators and to talk about some of these issues from a specifically faith-based kind of orientation. And so Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon is another one that we might commend to you. What's going on in Portland, right? Yeah, right. It's interesting the way Portland has become sort of poster child for a lot of things. But I think we all know, we're here, right? And there's a lot of things going on in Portland. And I think that we are called to engage in a lot of what's happening. And that the Oregonian is publishing the violent protests and the tear gas. There's still more peaceful protests. Right, I do know that in the neighborhood right near Grace Memorial, every weekday at noon, is that right? Does anyone know, Anne, do you know? Every weekday at noon, there's a sort of demonstration for Black Lives Matter and racial justice, that people show up every weekday at noon on Broadway. And there, there's a lot happening. And I think showing up to those things is really how we are called to participate. At least for me, that's how I feel called for that. And then Roseanne said, it seems like Christian nationalist groups are very effective with single issue Christians. We need a more streamlined messages. I remember the past saying, what would Jesus do? We have discovered how effective it is to repeat the same truth or lie. Yeah, I think that that's a fair comment. And, when people ask me, what's our faith about? My favorite is from the presiding bishop. If it's not about love, then it's not about God, right? And I think finding a way to sort of, and Madeline said every Friday at noon at St. David's, all the bells, they ring the bells and say names out loud for people who've died, Black folks and people of color who've died by police violence and other public violence every Friday at St. David's in Southeast Portland. Yeah, so how are we called to sort of be a public witness to what's happening in the world? I see we're almost out of time. I want to thank y'all for gathering for this conversation, for being part of it. And I just am grateful, for folks showing up and wrestling with these issues. And I think that if anything, what this book and this conversation has led me to is to think about the ways I can be more public with my faith. Like, for example, this is a very small example, but I never used to post my sermons on Facebook because I thought it was like, I don't know, gauche or brave. I don't know what I thought. I just didn't do it, right? And then I ran into a friend that I've known for years because our kids were in school together at the grocery store. And she said, I always listen to your sermons when you post them. This woman she's not Christian. She will probably never come to church. But she listens to my sermons. And I think that that's the piece, right? Like, how can we show up in our faith in spaces outside places like this, right? And continue to have our faith be the energy with which we are propelled into the world and that we draw on. I think that that's super, super important. Yeah, and thanks to all as we try to figure out how to have these conversations during this time of COVID. I really appreciate y'all showing up. I look forward to the day when more and more of us have been vaccinated and we can gather in a room and have this conversation in real time and real space. But right now, I really appreciate y'all being here for the conversation and asking hard and good questions of this group and of ourselves. And let's continue to ask hard and good questions of our church, right? And how we can maybe provide an alternative vision to what it means to be a Christian in civic life in this country and in this time. Oh, Union of Black Episcopalians. Yes, thank you, Anna. So I will just put in a plug for a couple diocesan opportunities. There is a newly reformed Union of Black Episcopalians. They will be having an Absalom Jones service on February 21st. Everyone in the diocese is invited to that. I also serve along with Madeline, who's on this call, Madeline Moore, on the Commission to End Racism in the diocese. There will be more and more opportunities for folks to engage in those conversations and that work. And I invite y'all, I know Trinity has a long and good history of working on this issue, and I look forward to ways that we can continue to have those conversations and work as a church in this time. Thank you all very much for being here. God bless you all. Happy Sunday.